agency for Onondaga County and the city of Syracuse to collect, preserve, and interpret the history of the community. The image that you're looking at there, a little washed out, I apologize, but that is a view of Syracuse just about the time it became a city. Started out as a village in 1825 when the Erie Canal was completed, became a city in 1848. This is a view about 1852, just a couple years after. One of the things that you'll notice is that the artist has focused the whole city on Onondaga Lake in the distance there. But you'll also notice that the built-up part of the city, where the tall buildings are, the churches and the houses and all the rest, it kind of stops. It doesn't go all the way to the lake. And I know it's kind of hard to see in this particular image, but the reason is that the whole southern half of the lake, from Liverpool all the way down to the city and all the way up the other side toward the town of Geddes, is completely covered with salt manufacturing. That was the economic basis for this community. In fact, it was the economic basis for the Erie Canal. The Erie Canal would not have been built if not for the salt industry in Syracuse, because salt, this was the major salt-producing area in America in the mid-19th century. And in order to get the salt out to market, they needed a transportation system. And in the early 19th century, there were no railroads, there were no cars, there were no trucks. And so the canal was one of the primary ways to get the salt to Albany and then down the Hudson River to New York, or over to Buffalo and on the Great Lakes and out to the Midwest to places like Chicago or St. Louis. Onondaga salt, Syracuse salt, spread over the whole Northeast through a lot of the 19th century. And the canal cost a lot of money. The Erie Canal cost millions of dollars back in the early 19th century, which would be, hundreds of millions of dollars today. And one of the ways they paid for it was the state put a tax on Syracuse salt. And they raised money, and that was one of the ways they were able to pay for the canal. So the city is growing based on the economy of the salt surrounding Onondaga Lake. Where did the salt come from? Didn't come from the lake. The lake is a freshwater body. But there is a large, solid vein of rock salt that spreads across New York State in the southern part, out near actually where you folks are from, out in the Lafayette County area, and spreads east and west. It is even mined today in some parts of the Finger Lakes. But in this instance, underwater natural springs that flow underground, flowing from the higher ground out near Tully, Lafayette, Pompey, in that area, wash through the rock salt, turn from fresh water into brine, into salt water, and came out near the shore of Onondaga Lake. Literally broke the surface. And that water, that brine, was much saltier than seawater. You took a gallon of seawater and a gallon of brine from the shore of Onondaga Lake, and you boiled it down, evaporated the water, you'd get much more salt out of the gallon from Onondaga Lake shore than you would out of seawater. And so that was the source. They had two ways of making salt, which we'll talk about in a minute. But of course, from a cultural standpoint, the lake's history really starts with Native Americans. There is evidence that there was Native American activity along the shores of Onondaga Lake as early as 10,000 years ago, in the prehistoric era, mainly as a source for fishing. There were fishing camps, temporary fishing camps that Native Americans would set up. Eventually, as the Native American culture developed, we get the formation of the Iroquois Confederacy, also known as the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. That confederacy of 5 nations, including the Onondaga Nation, which was the central nation, they formed their confederacy on the shore of Onondaga Lake. And the Onondaga Nation was, in fact, the capital, you could say, of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. Their village was in the southern hills south of Syracuse, but Onondaga Lake was kind of their front door. This is the way they traveled on Onondaga Lake. They did not use birch bark canoes, they used elm bark canoes. And from Onondaga Lake, you could go into the river system, and you could go to many places throughout North America from there. We have to also remember that the Onondaga Nation is still here. They live on their territory. I'm sure, being from the Lafayette area, you're familiar with the Onondaga Nation territory. That land that is the Onondaga Nation has always been their land. It has never been anybody else's land except theirs. This is an image of Faithkeeper Oren Lyons. Because of the importance of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy in the early colonial era of the French and the English struggling for control of North America, the Iroquois sort of got caught up in that. As early as 1615, this is a view, a very stylized view from a European engraver showing a battle along the shore of Onondaga Lake. You see Onondaga Lake at the top of the image. This is a representation of an Iroquois village, not particularly accurate, but in Europe they didn't really know exactly what they looked like. This is Samuel du Champlain, the founder of Quebec, in conjunction with his Huron allies attacking this Iroquois village. You see the French soldiers with the muskets arrayed along. They even constructed a little siege tower like you would if you were attacking a castle over in Europe. So from as early as 1615, Onondaga Lake is figuring in this struggle between the French and the English, and that Onondaga Lake keeps popping up well into the 18th century as the French and the English kind of maneuver for control and friendship and allyship with the Iroquois nations. I talked about the salt industry. After the American Revolution, the American government and the New York State government created territories for the Onondagas, a series of land claims and treaties that are still being debated today. But the state was able to open up the shore of Onondaga Lake to salt manufacturing. This depicts the two different kinds of salt manufacturing. And the bottom in the middle, you see what were called boiling blocks. That was one of the ways they made salt around Onondaga Lake. At one time, at the peak of the industry in the 1860s, that era, there were close to 300 of those boiling blocks. As you see, they were lined up with big kettles that would hold the brine. They'd light a fire underneath at one end. The heat would be drawn down to a tall chimney. On the left side, you see some of the boiling blocks lined up along the Erie Canal. And that heat going under those kettles would evaporate the brine and create the salt crystals, which then could be shoveled out and put in the bins on the side to dry. The other way they made salt here was called solar evaporation, using essentially solar energy. You take the brine, you spread it out in these shallow vats, let it sit there with the sun and the wind working on it for several weeks, and eventually the water part evaporates and you're left with salt crystals. And men could go out, you see in the upper right there, and literally rake the salt to the end of the shed, and then it would be loaded away. The salt industry lasted from the 1790s until 1926 around the shore of Onondaga Lake. Eventually lost out to competition from cheaper sources of salt elsewhere. The lake also had, so from the beginning the lake is viewed as this industrial economic source. But it also had an era where there was some recreation that occurred around the lake. The iron pier that you see here, and this is a very stylized view. The artist is using a lot of his imagination here. All of these different things that you see depicted here did occur on Onondaga Lake, but sort of not all at the same time like he's depicting here. The iron pier sat right where Destiny USA or the Carousel Mall, whatever you want to call it. And this was a place where you could take a streetcar or a train from the city to the iron pier and then get on a boat and go out to other resorts that were on another part of the lake. There's the steamboat going over to one of the resorts. One of them was White City. These were resorts on the lake that were not really bathing beaches. People didn't really think of the lake too much as a place to go swimming because of all the industry that was around it. They would go out, as you see there, the ladies in their long 1890s, turn-of-the-century gowns. They didn't go swimming. They'd ride on the rides. There were bowling alleys. There were dance halls. There were places to drink beer. There were entertainment of different kinds that occurred at the resorts, but they weren't primarily places to go swimming to a large degree. There was even at one time a baseball park out there. You see the lake in the distance. If you sort of know where the regional market is, which is kind of across the street from Destiny USA, that's right where that baseball stadium was, Star Park it was called. One of the big changes that occurred in Onondaga Lake as the salt industry started to slowly peter out after the Civil War, there was a new industry that came in called the Solvay Process Company. The Solvay Process Company, the Solvay process was a process, a chemical process invented by two brothers in Belgium whose last name was Solvay, hence the Solvay process. And what it was a artificial means of making soda ash by chemical process. Soda ash can be mined, but it also can be produced chemically. Soda ash is an ingredient that's used in a lot of other products to make, for example, glass and other things. And the first process, the first artificial solvate process plant in America was on the shore of Onondaga Lake. Why? They needed a couple of different things for the solvate process. They needed brine to make the chemical reaction. They knew there was brine here. They needed limestone. There's a lot of limestone out in the hills south of Syracuse, which they could quarry and bring in. They needed fresh water for part of the process, which they had with Onondaga Lake, and they needed good transportation. And by this period in the 1880s, when the plant opened up, you had not only canal transportation, but you had railroad transportation. So they were making soda ash, but part of the process, at the end of the process, you wound up with this sort of waste material, almost like a toothpaste-like material. And they started just dumping it on the shore of Onondaga Lake, hence what were called the waste beds. And you see in this image here, the plant up in the upper right corner with the lake in the distance, and then this aerial view showing the growing waste bed, the one there in the middle almost extending halfway across Onondaga Lake. Not a particularly pleasant aspect of the lake with this pollution. After a while, they also started to sneak other things into the waste going into Onondaga Lake, including mercury. At the same time, down at the southern end of the lake, way down in the right-hand corner, there was an outlet from Onondaga Creek where a lot of the city sewage was going into the creek. Later on, there was a sewage plant built there, but even that was putting a different kind of sewage into the lake. So by the 20th century and the mid-20th century, Onondaga Lake is becoming one of the most polluted lakes in North America. What's happening along the shoreline? Well, by the early 20th century, the salt industry is dying out, and all these solar sheds, and there were 50,000 of them at one time, start to be abandoned and look like this. And so there's a lot of land available around Onondaga Lake. Do they decide to make it into a park on the waterfront, so Syracuse has a waterfront park? No, as you see here in this 1902 headline, not machinery hums where once the sun rays made salt. A lot of that area where all the solar salt sheds were along the shore of the lake, the solar salt sheds are made out of wood, they get knocked out of the way, and this was an era of great industrial growth in America in the late 19th, early 20th century. And all of these factories start going into that relatively cheap land, filling in, again, between the downtown, the city, and the lake shore. And in 1902, it was very appropriate to show a smokestack billowing out lots of dark smoke, because that meant that the economy was booming. Today we look at that and we think pollution. This is that industrial district. It's an area that's now called Franklin Square. It's kind of between downtown and Destiny, USA. And a whole number of factories went into that area very quickly, right after the beginning of the 20th century. Up in the left-hand corner, you see one of the products that they made there. These were power forging hammers. You all know a blacksmith, when he's working, he has a hammer like that. Well, you know, a blacksmith could only hit so hard. These were powered by steam engines, and they could bring thousands of pounds of pressure down for manufacturing large things. So this was just one product that was made in the Franklin Square area, and these forging hammers were shipped all over the world. Another change that came to the shore of Onondaga Lake, we know about the Erie Canal. There was the Oswego Canal, which went from Syracuse up to Oswego. But in 1918, the New York State replaced those old 19th century canals with the barge canal, which is still in existence today. And they decided, Syracuse said, we need a harbor on the barge canal. Now the barge canal runs kind of way up north of Syracuse, up near Brewerton and Baldwinsville and up that area. So they used the river system to hook Onondaga Lake into the barge canal, make it part of the barge canal, and then dredged a channel right into the heart of the lakefront to create the barge canal terminal. And this is an image. They actually built boats there at one time. They also unloaded cargo there. But it turned out that the most economical thing to use for the barge canal terminal was oil. They did bring in lumber, they did bring in coal,
but eventually that became more efficient to transport by train or by truck. The thing that seemed to make sense, at least in the early 20th century, was oil, for gasoline, for heating homes and so forth. So the oil would literally come in on barges, which would come into the barge canal terminal and unload. And so where did they unload to? They needed all of these oil storage tanks, which then trucks could come and take it from the storage tank and deliver it to different places. So the inner harbor area that used to be covered with salt sheds turned into Oil City, what people used to call Oil City, with hundreds of these oil storage tanks. And way up at the top, very top of the image, you might just get a little sense of the edge of downtown Syracuse. Well, people sort of thought, okay, we got a solvent process polluting Onondaga Lake, we've got oil storage tanks up there, so we don't really care what else goes up around the shore of Onondaga Lake. So around the turn of the century, they built an actual garbage plant up on the shore of Onondaga Lake, and then later on in the 1930s, they constructed a gasification plant, a plant that could make gas, like you turn your stove on. They made it by burning coal. Now today we get gas from natural gas that's mined, but back then they could make it by a gasification process. And so the shoreline of Onondaga Lake is really by the early to mid 20th century, sort of this area that's been consigned to be polluted and forgotten about. If you want a nice clean lake to live next to or to go swimming in or to enjoy from a recreational standpoint, you have Oneida Lake, you have Cazenovia Lake, you have Skinny Lake, you have lakes in Tully. And so those alternatives sort of let the community say, we can sacrifice Onondaga Lake. Now that's not to say that there weren't some visionary people that said, we ought to try and do something with the lake shore, a little more positive than solid process plants and waste beds and oil storage tanks. And so in the late 1920s, where the old Oswego Canal ran along the shore of the lake, and it ran all the way along the east shore of the lake up through Liverpool and north of there, that was abandoned. Remember, the state built the barge canal, so they didn't need the old Oswego Canal, and they just abandoned it. It was left to rot. And so in 1928, a plan came forward, proposed parkway around Onondaga Lake. Very ambitious plan. But in 1928-29, there was no money to build this thing. Where was the city or the county going to come up with the money to do this? Well, what happened in 1929, the Great Depression arrived. And who was governor of New York State when the Great Depression first arrived? His name was Franklin Roosevelt. He didn't become president until 1932. And so in that period between 1930 and 1932, Roosevelt, as governor of New York State, started a lot of the public works projects that he would become famous for when he became president. And so essentially what the state said in the early 1930s to communities across the state, we have a lot of unemployment, the depression is on, we need to put men to work very quickly. Do you have what today would be called, do you have any shovel-ready projects ready to go? And they pulled off the shelf the proposed parkway plan and quickly put a whole bunch of men to work, and they created Onondaga Lake Parkway, which you may know today runs along the east shore of Onondaga Lake, and they created Onondaga Lake Park. That was done by the county. So the city part was developing with oil tanks, and the county part up along Liverpool was developing into a park. Eventually, what happened to the lakefront area? Well, the lake got very polluted. Eventually, the oil tanks weren't needed much anymore because they were transporting oil through a whole pipeline system. The factory area that was making those forging hammers and all the rest of it, after World War II, a lot of those factories moved out of the area. They moved to cheaper places to do that kind of manufacturing in the South or overseas in China or other places, and a lot of those factories were abandoned. And so the lakefront area in the 1980s was in pretty sad shape. The lake was pretty polluted, and the lakefront between Syracuse and the lake that had been salt and then manufacturing and oil tanks was kind of abandoned, and that's kind of what the area was faced with in the 1980s. But then a plan came together, and you see there sort of the two partners for the plan. The guy on the right is Bob Conjul, the main owner of the Pyramid Companies, and he had a vision for the shore of Onondaga Lake. The man on the left is Mayor Tom Young, who was the mayor of Syracuse back in the 1980s, and it had to be sort of a public-private partnership to make this thing work. You see there on the model, it was a fairly ambitious plan, and all of that stuff didn't happen. But the catalyst for it, sort of the way they were going to do it, Conjul was a mall builder, and he wanted to build a mall. And he said to the mayor, look, you're going to tax me if I build this mall, but let's do something different. Let's do a pilot agreement, payment in lieu of taxes. I'll pay you money, but it's not tax money. It's money that you have to use to improve the lakefront area. That's the deal. I'll build the mall in the city as opposed to out in the suburbs. But instead of you taxing me regular taxes, I'll make a different deal. I'll give you payment in lieu of taxes if you use it to improve the lakefront. And that was the deal that was kind of struck. So there was in the area there where you see that sort of little network of roads there, that's right where Destiny USA is today. That was a scrapyard, a junkyard, and all those oil tanks surrounded it. And that was a drawing that was put together in the 1980s saying maybe this is what this area could become if we have some vision and leadership. The first step was to build the mall right where the scrapyard was. And there you see it under construction. And I'm sure some of you have been there. And that's, the mall. It was called Carousel Center because they actually tracked down one of the original rides from one of those resorts that I talked about earlier out on the shore of the lake, and they put it in there. Abandoned factories down in the Franklin Square area were turned into office space. This is an interesting shot. This is one of the factories. The picture on the left, they actually, in this factory, made a section where they could bring a train right inside the factory. You see the railroad tracks there? And they could pull several freight cars into the factory, and on the right side there, they could unload or load the freight cars. That's what that area looked like in the 1980s after the factory was abandoned. That's what it looks like today after the building was renovated. It was turned into an atrium for the office spaces. This building that says Rescue Mission on it actually was an old typewriter factory from the early 20th century. That had been abandoned, junk cars around it and all the rest of it. That was turned into condominiums. This was all sort of to get the lakefront area changed into something more positive. They created a park, as you see on the right, in the middle of that that former industrial district. One of the other things they did was take the fact that Onondaga Creek flows through this whole area and try and turn Onondaga Creek into an almost invisible resource and into something that people could walk along and enjoy. So the creek walk, the first phase was done as early as 1987. Now they've completed the next phase. So you can actually walk along Onondaga Creek all the way from Armory Square downtown, all the way out to Onondaga Lake. It's about 2.5 miles. There's some more sections of the creek walk that have been opened more recently. And of course, part of the key to this whole future vision for what the lakeshore could be is what's called the Inner Harbor, the old barge canal terminal, where I showed you they were building a tugboat and they were unloading coal and oil and all the rest of it. None of that is going on. You see it up in the 1980s when it was still a sort of a maintenance area with all the oil tanks, and you see it today. It's been turned into sort of a harbor. All the oil tanks are gone. And this is the latest plan. This company called Core is going to redo all the structures, or build new structures around that actual Inner Harbor area. On the bottom is going to be a hotel. All those buildings sort of on the left of the water are going to be apartments and townhouses, and there's going to be more shops over there on those two little fingers, those two wings that come out into the Inner Harbor. This is the last historic building that's left there in the Inner Harbor. It's the freight house that was built in 1918 when the barge canal was first opened as a place if they unloaded actual freight that could be stored in this building until it was delivered. It was hardly ever used because most of the stuff that came into the barge canal was bulk stuff. coal and lumber, and then of course later on oil. And you don't really put coal or lumber or oil in a building like that. But it is, dates from 1918, and they're gonna reuse it as some sort of visitor center and history center. We are, in fact, in the process of working with the city right now to put a whole series of interpretive signs all along the creek walk to tell a lot of this history that I've just been telling you today. And that's the end of the images. We might have a couple of minutes for questions, if anybody has some questions before we have to switch groups. I kind of ran through that sort of quickly, but maybe anyone have any questions about anything? No? Nothing at all?
Let us sink in, folks.
Okay.
You've all got Onondaga Lake questions, the cleanup that we did the cleanup earlier, right? Why do you guys have specific topics? Ran through a bunch of stuff there that'll help you big time, right? Anything else still up in the air?
One of the things you may have read about recently is the Onondaga Nation has been actively pursuing a land claim because their position is that after the American Revolution in the late 18th century, when New York State wanted this territory, especially they wanted access to the brine springs around the shore of Onondaga Lake, then treaties were signed that were illegal. And the Onondagas have been pushing for a recognition that those treaties were illegal, primarily so that they can get a seat at the table in terms of how Onondaga Lake is going to be cleaned up. There's a lot of cleanup that's going on right now, but the Onondaga Nation feels that part of their responsibility to the environment is to have a more powerful say in what's happening with the cleanup of Onondaga Lake. And that's part of the leverage that they want this land claim to be able to, as part of the settlement for that. But that's an ongoing issue, which you're probably aware of. Well, if there are no questions, if you want to flip the groups.